however, is where there are lots and lots of people in the world that know a lot more than I do as a gas passer guy to do a literature research. We've all gone to PubMed or Medline or Cinol or whatever your database is, and you've typed in a couple words and you get some articles, and you've called that a literature search. I did. I wrote lots of papers for my doctoral degree where I went and looked and I found 10 or 15 articles that talked about what I wanted them to talk about, right? You can say anything. You can find somebody who's written something about it. But to truly say you've done a detailed, exhaustive literature search where every single thing that's possibly written in the English language I have laid eyes on is a very difficult process if you don't have someone who is an expert at it. A research librarian is an invaluable member of this process. Invaluable. Because I had no idea what I was doing when I started doing a literature search. I sat down in your office, I never forget, and within about 45 minutes, I learned about databases that I didn't know existed and ways to put all the little dollar signs and dots and asterisks that actually meant something to the computer that I had no idea, and it was amazing. I realized when I started my initial literature search that in my protocol, I listed way too many databases. But the problem is, once your protocol is approved, it's your roadmap. You've got to do that. It's kind of like your flight plan. You can't deviate from the flight plan unless you go back and get your flight plan reapproved. Okay? And obviously English language was an issue. So what did I find? Well, initially I found about 488 studies that to me looked pretty relevant. I did all kinds of stuff to figure out these were removed for this reason, and these were removed for that reason, and ultimately I ended up with 9 studies that I was able to include in my systematic review. How did I figure out these 9 studies? It was my inclusion and exclusion criteria. I determined what I wanted and didn't want the studies to talk about. So I ultimately did a meta-analysis on 9 studies. Lots of problems with the articles, as you can imagine. We talked about poorly written articles. We talked about data being presented inappropriately. One of them had great data, but it didn't present it the right way. I tried to get in touch with that author, and I found out he was dead, so it was very difficult for him to... Yeah, the anesthesia didn't work on that guy. It took me to do the complete literature search 5 months. Now, that's not 5 months of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. That was 5 months of working full-time and doing some work on it, obviously daily, but not necessarily sitting there at a computer searching for 5 months. If you're in a position where you're a researcher and your job is to do research, you can probably do a full literature search in a couple weeks, honestly, if that's what you did all day. I didn't. The article critique, although it seems kind of simple, it's really, really important. This is the rigor of a systematic review. In my opinion, this is where a systematic review is different from a literature search, a literature review. Because you're going through and determining, does this article meet my criteria to use it or not use it? And does this article have the methodological quality that I believe the data that's been presented? And this is a really, really, it'll take very long to do, but it's a very, very important step. And this is why there's always a primary and a secondary reviewer in this process. I have to do it, my secondary reviewer had to do it, and if we didn't agree, we had to figure out why we didn't agree. And so I think this gives a lot of strength and credibility to the review. I extracted all the information out of it, basically pulled the data out and plugged it into the software package, and this is what it spit out. And I said, well, what does this mean? This is a forest plot. These are all my individual articles. This is actually a screenshot from the data analysis piece, and I don't want to bore y'all with a bunch of statistics after lunch, but suffice it to say is, it didn't really mean a lot initially to me. So my data analysis part was a little confusing to me because I'm not a statistician, and so I had to go kind of figure out what these statistics ultimately meant. Basically, you have to figure out if this data represents the population as a whole, right? We've all kind of heard about that in research. We learned it kind of even in basic statistics when you're pulling a bunch of articles, a bunch of people out of the population as a whole. You can pull only 18-year-old women. Well, that's fine, but you can't apply those results to everybody in the world who's having an anesthetic if only 18-year-old women are who you study, right? So that's where this piece comes into play. What I found was that it looked statistically like my data was way, way, way not applicable to everybody as a whole. And I decided, as a clinician, well, the numbers may say this, but I know anesthesia. I don't know much else, but I know a lot about anesthesia, and I know that the information that I'm getting out of these articles is applicable to anesthesia as a whole. So I actually changed the way I ran the statistics, and my data analysis piece sort of evolved as I learned about statistical analysis. And I use something called a random effects model. And basically what a random effects model says, not to bore you all with all the statistics, is that the differences are not causative, meaning A does not cause B. But using this method of statistical analysis, I can say that A leads to B, or A has an impact on B. Does that make sense? Okay. So I determined that all the studies were basically the same in methodological quality. One wasn't really good, one wasn't really bad, but overall they all kind of said the same thing. And they looked very similar variables. They looked at, did you use the monitor? And if you did, how long did they stay in the recovery room? And so here are my results after about a year of doing this, that using this random effects model, explaining this heterogeneity, this ability to apply it to the whole population, if you use this thing, you go home about 3.5 minutes faster. Who cares, right? 3.5 minutes. Seriously? This is, I mean, 3.5 minutes. A year of work for 3.5 minutes. Which, guess what? It was not statistically significant. So, okay, that's a little disappointing, right? 3.5. I was hoping like 76 hours these people got to go home early. But then I sort of started thinking about it, and this is where a systematic review, I think, is really important to make sure that you have somebody on your review group that kind of understands and maybe has a passion for what you're doing. Because 3.5 minutes may sound like nothing to some people, but I'm here to tell y'all it is incredibly significant clinically, and here's why. The technology does not lead to a decrease in their length of stay in the recovery room. In other words, if I use it, they don't go home earlier. I can't say that it caused them to go home earlier, but that it contributes to the reduction in the length of stay. I don't know if anybody else has read the newspaper, but there are no more dollars available to pay for anything in the entire world, period, especially healthcare. I don't care if you're an outpatient rehab, inpatient, dentistry, it doesn't matter. There's no more money. So how is it that I can take this 3.5 minutes and say it's useful? Well, what I will tell you is the most expensive piece of an anesthetic is the time in the operating room. The second most expensive piece of an anesthetic is the time in the recovery room. It's about $58 a minute to be in the operating room. It's about $8.87 a minute to be in the recovery room. Well, if I use this technology on just my one patient, I worked yesterday, I did 17 anesthetics. So on my one patient, I can save $37.80 in today's US dollars. Well, that's on one patient. My facility does about 10,000 anesthetics a year. You can see $37.80 times 10,000 adds up to real, tangible, usable results. And to me, that's cash. So although statistically it didn't seem all that exciting, and 3.5 minutes is like whoop-de-doo, and I actually submitted it to JBI, and that's exactly what the reviewers came back to me and said, who cares? 3.5 minutes, explain to me why, excuse me, why we should even publish this. And I thought, I know how. We're going to figure out how much it costs. So what I determined was we need to use this thing if we want to save some time in the recovery room, potentially. And we need to figure out what the optimal level is. Remember I told you there's that variability on how asleep and how awake. And we don't know exactly what is perfect in terms of getting them out of the recovery room quicker. What did I learn? It is a long time to do the literature search, especially if you're doing a million other things like everybody in the audience is doing. But a research librarian is absolutely, you can't do it without. And you got to kind of think outside the box a little bit. Just because you get some of these numbers, you got to figure out what those numbers really mean. Australian and American thinking are different. Australian and American English is different, and sometimes when you write to JBI and you get a response via email, what they're responding to you and what you asked are totally different things. And it's just a matter of how you phrase things and how they phrase things.